In the Empire of Oakhaven, blood is the only currency that matters. And tonight, the vaults of House Beaumont have run dry. The High Council chamber is a tomb of cold marble and sharper tongues, where the scent of expensive incense struggles to mask the smell of a brewing execution. At the center of the pit stands Lady Eleanor Beaumont. Her spine is a column of ice, her chin held high even as her hands tremble against the heavy silk of her maternity gown. She is the most powerful Duchess in the Northern Territories, but to the men looking down from their golden perches, she is merely a fallen woman. "Silence!" The Marquis de Valois slams his gavel, the sound echoing like a bone snapping. He leans forward, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Lady Eleanor, the scandal has reached the ears of the Emperor himself. You stand here, carrying an heir to an ancient line, yet you claim the father is a nameless wretch from the borderlands? A blacksmith who mends shoes for copper. You have not only stained your bed, Duchess, you have forfeited your lands." A ripple of cruel, melodic laughter sweeps through the gallery. The nobility leans in, hungry for the kill. They don't see Eleanor's eyes flick toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. They don't see the ghost of a smile touching her pale lips. "My lands are my own, Marquis." Eleanor's voice cuts through the mockery like a blade. "And my husband is exactly what this court deserves. You call him a wretch. I call him your replacement." The doors don't just open, they groan under the weight of the man pushing them. Alistair St. Clair enters the room, and the temperature seems to drop 10 degrees. He is dressed in the rough, soot-stained leathers of a commoner, his massive frame dwarfing the guards who try, and fail, to block his path. His face is a mask of jagged scars and terrifying calm. This is the man the world thinks is a lowly servant. This is the scandal. But as he reaches Eleanor's side and wraps a calloused, heavy hand around her waist, he doesn't look at her with the submissiveness of a peasant. He looks at the Marquis with the cold, calculating gaze of a wolf who has finally found the sheep's throat. "The Marquis asked a question." Alistair's voice is a deep, vibrating baritone that makes the champagne flutes in the gallery rattle. "He wants to know if a blacksmith is fit to sire a duke. I think the better question is a Marquis fit to breathe the same air as the man who is about to take his head?" Before the guards can move, before the Marquis can even find his breath to scream for treason, Alistair reaches into the collar of his rough tunic. He doesn't pull out a weapon. He pulls out a heavy, blackened silver chain. Hanging from it is a signet ring the size of a man's thumb, embossed with the forbidden crest of the House of Valerius, the sovereign line that was supposed to have been wiped out in the Great Purge 5 years ago. The room falls into a deathly, suffocating silence. The Marquis turns the color of ash. He recognizes that ring. Everyone in the Empire knows the legend. The Iron Duke of Valerius didn't die. He simply disappeared into the smoke. Alistair leans in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that carries to every corner of the room. "I've spent 5 years mending iron and waiting for the world to rot. It seems the harvest is finally ready. Eleanor is my wife. This child is my blood. And this court is now under my command. If you're already hooked on the fall of the Beaumonts and the rise of the secret duke, you're in the right place. We're just getting started with this epic journey of betrayal and sovereign revenge. Before we begin to see how the Duchess first found her blacksmith in the mud, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the moment the Marquis realizes exactly who he just insulted. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the reign and the forge. The story of the Empire's greatest scandal didn't begin in a palace. It began in the mud of the Blackwood borderlands, 3 months before the Council's judgment. The rain in Blackwood is thick, smelling of pine and old secrets. Lady Eleanor Beaumont had traveled 4 days without her carriage, disguised in the heavy wool of a merchant's daughter. She was running out of time and allies. Her father was dead, Her accounts were frozen by the Marquis de Valois, and the news of her pregnancy was a ticking time bomb that would give her enemies the excuse they needed to seize her estate. She pushed open the door to a small, isolated forge at the edge of the forest. The heat hit her like a physical blow. Inside, a man stood with his back to her, his bare torso glistening with sweat and firelight. The muscles of his back moved like tectonic plates as he brought a massive hammer down on a glowing bar of steel. "I don't take commissions from the capital," the man said without turning. His voice was like a grinding stone. "I didn't come for a sword, Alistair St. Clair," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the hammer's deafening rhythm. The man stopped mid-swing. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of ozone and iron. He turned slowly, the orange glow of the forge catching the terrifying intelligence in his eyes. He wasn't the broken man the rumors suggested. He was a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. "That name is buried in a mass grave 5 miles from here," he said, stepping into her personal space. He stood a full foot taller than her, a mountain of coal-dusted muscle and quiet menace. "Why should I not kill you for breathing it?" "Because I am the only one left who knows you're innocent," Eleanor replied, looking him directly in the eye. "And because I am carrying the future of this empire. The council wants me dead, and they want my child declared a bastard. I need a husband who can kill a man with his bare hands and navigate a ballroom without breaking china. I need the Duke of Valerius to play the part of a servant." Alistair looked at her, his gaze dropping to her stomach before returning to her face. He saw the desperation, but more importantly, he saw the fire. He reached out, his rough thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than a blade. "You want a monster to wear a leash?" Alistair asked, a dark smirk tugging at his lips. "I want a king to reclaim his throne," she countered. Alistair turned back to the forge, plunging the red-hot steel into a bucket of water. The hiss of steam filled the room, shrouding them in white mist. "The price of my help isn't gold, Eleanor. When this is over and your enemies are ashes, I don't go back to the forge. I take my place beside you, permanently." "Agreed," she whispered, and with that one word, the fate of the Oakhaven Empire was sealed. The Duchess had found her protector, and the exiled Duke had found his way home. They began their journey back to the capital the next morning, a Duchess and her lowly blacksmith, ready to walk into the den of lions and tear it down from the inside. The empire of Oakhaven is built on the lie that silk is stronger than iron, and tonight, that lie is being tested. The High Council chamber of the Solstice Palace is a cathedral of excess, filled with men who have never known the weight of a hammer or the sting of a blister. The air is thick with the scent of ambergris and the sharp metallic tang of cold ambition. High above the floor, seated in a semicircle of gilded thrones, the Council of Sovereigns looks down at the center of the room. There, standing on a cold marble seal, is Lady Eleanor Beaumont. She is the last of the Beaumonts, a bloodline that once held the keys to the Empire's northern armories. But tonight, she is a target. The swell of her pregnancy is undeniable beneath her velvet gown, and to the vultures on the high seats, it is the only evidence they need to strip her of her legacy. "Lady Eleanor," a voice drawls from the center throne. It is the Marquis de Valois, a man whose smile is as sharp and empty as a shard of glass. "You were summoned to answer for the desecration of your house. For months, rumors have crawled through the capital like rats. They say the Duchess of the North has abandoned her dignity. They say she has been seen in the borderlands, consorting with the dregs of the earth. And now, you stand before us, carrying the proof of your shame." A wave of snickering ripples through the gallery. Noblewomen hide their smirks behind lace fans. Men whisper behind gloved hands. Eleanor does not flinch. She keeps her gaze locked on Valois, her spine as rigid as a spear. "I have broken no laws, Marquis." Eleanor's voice rings out clear and defiant. "My child is an heir of House Beaumont. My marriage is recognized by the border chapels. If the council finds my choice of husband distasteful, that is a matter of etiquette, not of state." Valois laughs, a dry rattling sound that echoes off the vaulted ceiling. "Etiquette? You have brought a common cur into a line of kings. You claim this blacksmith, this Alistair, is your husband, a man who makes his living in the dirt? The law states that an estate of the first rank cannot be passed to a bastard of the low-born. By your own admission, you have rendered House Beaumont extinct. By the authority of the Emperor, I move to declare your lands forfeit and your titles null." "The law also states," Eleanor interrupts, her voice rising in power, "that a husband of any rank becomes the protector of his wife's estate in times of crisis. I have not rendered my house extinct. I have reinforced it." "With what?" Valois sneers, leaning so far forward he nearly falls from his throne. "With coal dust and horseshoe nails? Bring him in. Let the court see this sovereign savior you found in the mud. Let us see the man who thinks he can stand where dukes have knelt." The Marquis gestures to the heavy oak doors at the rear of the chamber. The gallery goes silent, every head turning to witness the final humiliation of the Beaumont line. They expect a man who will cower. They expect someone who will blink at the brightness of the chandeliers and trip over his own feet. The doors don't open. They shudder. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoes through the hall, the sound of boots that carry the weight of a mountain. Then the oak groans as the doors are pushed wide. Alistair St. Clair walks into the light. He is covered in the grime of travel, his rough leather tunic stained with the soot of the forge and the salt of the road. He is a titan of a man, his shoulders so broad they seem to block out the very light of the hallway behind him. His face is a map of scars and sun-darkened skin, his eyes hooded and dark. He doesn't walk, he prowls. Every step is a deliberate threat. As he reaches the marble seal where Eleanor stands, he doesn't look at the council. He doesn't look at the finery. He looks only at Eleanor. He reaches out a hand that is twice the size of hers, a hand calloused by fire and iron, and gently takes her fingers. "You're late," Eleanor whispers, her voice finally betraying a hint of the terror she's been hiding. Alistair turns his head toward the high thrones. His eyes aren't those of a frightened peasant. They are the eyes of a man who has seen empires fall and didn't think they were worth saving. "I had to ensure the steel was tempered," Alistair says. His voice is a low, tectonic rumble that seems to vibrate in the very floorboards beneath the Marquis's feet. He looks up at Valois, his expression one of bored, predatory hunger. "Now, which one of you is the Marquis? I was told there was a man here who had a problem with my wife's inheritance. I've come to see if he's brave enough to say it to my face." The humiliation the council intended for Eleanor has evaporated. In its place is a suffocating primal fear. The Marquis de Valois stares down at the blacksmith, and for the first time in his life, he feels the cold, certain breath of his own mortality. The silence in the council chamber is brittle, held together only by the Marquis's stunned disbelief. But as the visual of Alistair's massive frame burns into the minds of the elite, we pull back. To understand the gravity of this moment, the moment a wolf entered a den of jackals, we have to look back at the desperate path that led Eleanor to the edge of the world. The transition from the gilded palace to the suffocating gray of the borderlands is a journey through a dying kingdom. 2 months prior to her appearance before the council, Lady Eleanor Beaumont stood on the precipice of total ruin. The Beaumont carriage, once a symbol of northern pride, had been replaced by a common, mud-splattered wagon. She wore a heavy cloak of rough-spun wool, her face hidden beneath a deep hood, traveling through the Blackwood forest where the law of the Emperor is nothing more than a ghost. The rain here doesn't fall. It punishes. It turns the road into a swamp and the air into a cold, wet shroud. Eleanor's breath hitched in the freezing wind, her hand instinctively protecting the small, secret life growing within her. She was searching for a man the locals spoke of only in hushed, terrified whispers, the legendary smith of the Blackwood Forge. They said he could mend a blade so perfectly that the seam vanished. They said he had the strength of 10 men and the eyes of a demon who had seen the bottom of the abyss. But Eleanor knew a different truth. She had spent weeks poring over her father's private ledgers, finding a name that had been systematically erased from every official record in Oakhaven: Alistair St. Clair. The path ended at a jagged outcrop of rock where a low stone building clung to the hillside like a barnacle. There was no sign, only the rhythmic, bone-deep thud of a hammer striking iron. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound felt like a heartbeat. Eleanor pushed open the heavy timber door. The heat inside was a physical wall, smelling of sulfur, charcoal, and scorched earth. In the center of the room, illuminated by the orange roar of the furnace, stood a giant. Alistair didn't turn. His back was a map of corded muscle and silvered scars, scars that Eleanor recognized. They weren't from a lash. They were the jagged marks of imperial star steel, the kind only used by the high executioners of Valerius. He lifted a massive hammer, his movements possessing a lethal, practiced grace that no common blacksmith could ever hope to mimic. "The border is closed to travelers, woman," Alistair said. His voice was deeper than the forge's roar, a low vibration that seemed to rattle the iron tools hanging on the walls. "And I don't forge jewelry for those hiding from the capital." "I didn't come for jewelry, Alistair St. Clair," Eleanor said, throwing back her hood. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire that rivaled his furnace. "I came for the man who was once called the Iron Duke. I came for the only man in this empire who has a reason to hate the Marquis de Valois more than I do." The hammer stopped mid-air. The only sound in the forge was the crackle of the coals and the heavy rhythmic breathing of a man who had been dead to the world for 5 years. Alistair turned slowly. In the flickering firelight, his eyes were cold, obsidian shards. He looked at Eleanor, not with curiosity, but with the weary calculation of a soldier who had seen too many traps. "That man died in the trenches of the Great Purge," Alistair growled, stepping toward her. He towered over her, his presence so immense that he seemed to swallow the light in the room. "You're talking to a ghost, Duchess, and ghosts have no interest in the politics of the living." "The living are currently stripping my house of its blood right," Eleanor countered, refusing to step back even as he loomed over her. "The Marquis has frozen my grain, bought my stewards, and tomorrow he will move to declare my pregnancy a scandal of the low-born. I don't need a ghost. I need a husband. I need a shadow so large that not even the council can see past it." Alistair's gaze dropped to her waist, then back to her defiant face. A dark, dangerous irony flickered in his expression. "You want me to walk back into that den of snakes? To wear the collar of a servant husband? To let those pampered dogs spit on my name while I stand silent at your heels?" "I want you to survive long enough to watch them burn," she whispered. Alistair reached out, his massive, soot-blackened hand hovering just inches from her throat before moving to grip the hilt of a dagger cooling on the workbench. "The Marquis thinks he's a player on a stage. He's forgotten what happens when the stage catches fire. If I do this, Eleanor Beaumont, I don't do it for your gold. I do it because I want to see the look on Valois' face when he realizes the man cleaning his boots is the man who owns his soul." He stepped into the light of the forge, the flames reflecting in his eyes like a promise of war. "Tell me, Duchess, Can you handle the weight of a monster in your bed? Because once I put on that ring, there is no turning back. I will be your blacksmith. I will be your scandal. But when the masks come off, I will be the only thing left standing in Oakhaven. The heat of the forge seemed to solidify between them, turning a desperate plea into a blood oath. Alistair didn't reach for a quill or parchment to seal their agreement. He reached into the heart of the coals with a pair of iron tongs, pulling out a glowing, white-hot bar of steel. A contract signed in ink can be burned, Eleanor, Alistair said, his voice dropping to a gravelly resonance that vibrated in her chest. But a contract forged in fire is immutable. You ask me to play the servant, to bow my head, to swallow the insults of men who aren't fit to sharpen my blades. I will do it. I will be your Alice. I will be the blacksmith who seduced a duchess. He plunged the steel into the cooling vat. The sudden explosion of steam hissed like 1,000 serpents, veiling them in a thick white shroud. Through the mist, his obsidian eyes never left hers. But understand this, he continued, stepping closer until she could feel the radiating heat from his skin. From the moment we cross the city gates, you are the only one who knows the truth. To your stewards, your guards, and your rivals, I am a brute, a mistake. You must treat me as such. If you show me a single moment of true respect in public, you give the Marquis the thread he needs to unravel us. Can you be cruel to me, Eleanor? Can you treat the man protecting your life like a dog at your table? Eleanor swallowed hard, her hand tightening over the swell of her stomach. The weight of the sacrifice hit her. To save her child's future, she had to become the very thing she hated, a cold, arrogant aristocrat who looked down on the man she relied on. I will do what I must. I will play the part of the disgraced Duchess who traded her honor for a commoner's strength. Alistair nodded, a grim ghost of a smile playing on his scarred lips. Then let us begin the transformation. He moved to a heavy iron chest buried beneath a pile of discarded horseshoes in the corner of the forge. With a grunt of effort, he heaved it open. Inside sat no gold, no jewels, only a set of rough dark leathers and a tattered soot-stained tunic. This was his camouflage. He stripped away his smithing apron, revealing the terrifying landscape of his torso. A body built for high-tier violence, marked by the history of a fallen empire. The Marquis de Valois expects a peasant, Alistair muttered as he pulled on the rough wool. I will give him a peasant so convincing it will haunt his dreams. I will carry your luggage. I will walk in the mud behind your carriage. I will let his menials push me aside in the hallways. Every insult they throw at me is a debt I am recording. And I promise you, Eleanor, when I finally collect, I will take interest in blood. He reached into a hidden pocket of the chest and pulled out a small, blackened silver band. It wasn't a wedding ring. It was a shackle of his own making, forged from the same iron as his hammer. He took Eleanor's hand, his palm massive and rough against her delicate skin, and slid the cold metal onto her finger. This is the mark of the Blackwood Forge, he whispered, to the world. It's a cheap trinket a commoner gave his conquest. To us it's a reminder that the hammer is always falling. The contract is sealed, Duchess. Pack your things. We have a palace to infiltrate. As they stepped out of the forge and into the relentless borderland rain, Alistair fell 3 paces behind her. His head dropped, his shoulders slumped, and the predatory light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dull, vacant stare. In an instant, the Iron Duke of Valerius had disappeared. In his place stood a nameless, lowly servant, following his mistress into the jaws of the capital. The infiltration had begun, and the High Council of Oakhaven had no idea that the man they were about to mock was the very man who held the keys to their graves. The transition from the wild, rain-lashed borderlands to the suffocating opulence of the Beaumont estate is a descent into a different kind of wilderness. Here the predators don't howl, they whisper. As the iron-bound carriage wheels clattered across the white marble courtyard of the Beaumont Manor, a crowd had already gathered. News of the Duchess's return and her shameful companion had traveled faster than the wind. Standing at the top of the grand stairs was a welcoming committee of vipers, the estate's senior staff, led by the steward Miller, and a handful of local minor nobles who had spent the last month picking at the edges of the Beaumont fortune. The carriage door opened. Eleanor stepped out first, her face a mask of weary aristocratic coldness, but all eyes bypassed her, landing instead on the man who climbed out behind her. Alistair looked like a stain on the pristine white stone. He was covered in the gray dust of the road, his hair matted, his massive shoulders hunched as he lugged two heavy iron-bound trunks as if they were made of feathers. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the dirt, the perfect picture of a man who knew he didn't belong in the light. "Good heavens," a young countess giggled, pressing a lace handkerchief to her nose. "I thought the smell of the borderlands was a myth. Eleanor, darling, is that it? It looks more like a bear in a tunic than a husband." "He is a blacksmith, Countess," Eleanor replied, her voice cutting through the humid afternoon air like a shard of ice. "He is here for his strength, not his conversation. Miller, show the man to the servants' entrance. He is to be scrubbed and put to work in the lower courtyards until I have need of him." Miller, the steward, stepped forward with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He flicked a silver-topped cane toward Alistair's chest, poking at the rough wool of his tunic. "Did you hear the Duchess, brute? Move along. The servants' quarters are in the cellar next to the coal stores. Try not to track mud on the carpets, or I'll have you flogged before sundown." Alistair didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He let the cane poke him, his body remaining as still as a statue. To the onlookers, it was the submissiveness of a broken dog. To Eleanor, who caught the briefest, millisecond-long tightening of the muscles in Alistair's jaw, it was the sound of a fuse burning toward a powder keg. "Yes, master," Alistair muttered, his voice a feigned, clumsy grunt. He hoisted the trunks and began the long walk around the side of the manor. As he passed the line of jeering nobles, one young lordling purposefully stuck out a polished leather boot to trip him. Alistair didn't stumble. He stepped over the foot with a heavy, deliberate tread that sent a vibration through the stone, making the young man jump back in alarm. "Watch yourself, peasant!" the lordling barked, trying to recover his dignity as the crowd laughed. Alistair didn't look back. He followed Miller into the shadows of the servants' wing, leaving the sunlight and the perfume of the upper court behind. For the next 3 hours, he allowed himself to be subjected to the ultimate degradation. He was doused with buckets of cold well water in the middle of the courtyard, scrubbed with harsh lye soap usually reserved for the horses, and given a set of formal servant's livery that was intentionally 2 sizes too small, designed to make his large frame look ridiculous and bulging. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Eleanor sent for him. She sat in her private study, the room lit by a single candelabra. When the doors opened, Alistair walked in. The tight livery was strained across his chest, the lace at the cuffs looking absurd against his scarred, blackened knuckles. Miller pushed him into the room and retreated, closing the doors with a sharp click. The moment they were alone, the peasant vanished. Alistair straightened his spine, and suddenly the small room felt crowded. He reached up, and with a single, effortless tug, he ripped the restrictive lace from his collars, his eyes igniting with a cold, terrifying fire. "The steward has a very expensive cane," Alistair said, his natural deep baritone returning like a thunderclap. "I wonder how many pieces it will break into when I finally make him eat it." Eleanor let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the borderlands. "You did well, Alistair. They believe you are a mindless beast. That is our greatest weapon." "Being a beast is easy," Alistair said, pacing the room with the predatory grace of a caged panther. "But if I am to stand beside you at the autumn gala, I cannot just be a beast in a suit. We have 3 weeks before the Marquis makes his move to seize the trade routes. You said you wanted to train me, Eleanor. Start. Show me how the vultures in this city dance. Eleanor moved to a small table where a set of 3 different wine glasses and 5 pieces of silver cutlery were laid out. Very well. In the capital, the way you hold a fork can be as deadly as a duel. We will start with the seating arrangements of the High Council. You must memorize— The Council of 7, Alistair interrupted, picking up the smallest, most delicate crystal glass between 2 massive fingers. He swirled it once, sniffing the air. Seated by seniority, unless the Emperor is presiding, in which case the Archduke of Valerius, my father, would have taken the right hand. This glass is for a 114-year-old Riesling, but you've laid it for a Bordeaux, and the silver is placed for a 4-course hunt breakfast, yet we are approaching dinner. Eleanor froze, her mouth slightly open. Alistair set the glass down with perfect silent precision. He looked at her, a dark, knowing smirk touching his lips. Did you truly think I spent my entire life at a forge, Eleanor? I was winning silver-tongued wars in these ballrooms while you were still in the nursery. You don't need to teach me how to be a noble. You need to teach me how to pretend I've forgotten. The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She hadn't just brought a protector into her home. She had brought a man who knew the game better than she did. But as the shadows lengthened in the room, a frantic knocking came at the door. It was her lead footman, his face pale as a ghost. My lady, the Marquis de Valois, he's moved. The Beaumont grain ships at the northern port. He's had them seized for inspection by the Imperial Guard. The trade routes are blocked. We are being bled dry before the auction even begins. Eleanor turned to Alistair, the blood draining from her face. The first strike. He's starting early. Alistair didn't look worried. He looked hungry. He wants to play with your grain? Good. Let him. He's looking at the ships, which means he isn't looking at his own bank ledgers. It's time we reminded the Marquis that iron isn't the only thing that can be forged in the dark. The candle flame flickered as the footman's shadow retreated, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the study. Eleanor's hands flew to the maps on her desk, her fingers tracing the jagged coastline of the northern ports. "He strangled us," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Without those grain shipments, the Beaumont name is worth less than the paper it's written on. By the time the grand auction arrives, the council will argue that I cannot even feed my own people, let alone manage a duchy. This isn't just a strike, Alistair. This is a death sentence." Alistair didn't move toward the maps. He stayed in the shadows, the absurd, tight servant's livery looking less like a costume and more like a skin he was preparing to shed. "Valois is a man of ledgers and law," Alistair said, his voice a low, rhythmic hum. "He believes that if he controls the ships, he controls the tide. He's forgotten that tides are moved by the moon, by things he cannot see and cannot touch." Alistair walked toward the window, looking out over the moonlit Beaumont gardens. "You have a trade route through the Blackwood Pass, don't you? The old mountain road that's been abandoned for decades?" "It's a graveyard," Eleanor countered, shaking her head. "The bridges are rotted, and the bandits— It would take a small army to clear it. Then it's lucky you married a man who knows where the ghosts are buried," Alistair replied. He turned back to her, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the true weight of the secret duke. There was no blacksmith left in his eyes. There was only the cold, lethal strategist who had once held the Empire's borders against the barbarian hordes. "I need 3 things, Eleanor. I need a horse that isn't from your stables. I need a map of the Valois family's private debt. And I need you to go to the ballroom tonight and look as if you've already lost." "You're leaving?" A sudden, sharp fear gripped her. The thought of being in this house of vipers without his shadow behind her made her breath catch. "I am going to call in a debt," Alistair said. his hand lingering on the door handle. By dawn, the Marquis will find that his inspection of your ships has caused a sudden, unexplained collapse in the price of his own iron mines. He wants to play with your life? I'm going to play with his empire. He vanished into the servants' corridor before she could reply. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Beaumont Manor was toxic. The news of the seized ships had spread like a plague, and the staff, sensing the end of their mistress's reign, had become bold. Breakfast was served late, the tea was cold, and the whispers in the hallways were loud enough for Eleanor to hear every jagged word. She sat in the morning room, forcing herself to sip the bitter tea, her eyes fixed on the garden where Alistair was supposed to be working. Instead, she saw a group of Valois' personal guards, men in crimson and gold, standing over a slumped figure in a tattered tunic. It was Alistair. He was on his knees, his head bowed, as one of the guards kicked a bucket of slop toward him. "Clean it up, blacksmith!" the guard barked, his laughter echoing against the stone walls. "The Marquis is coming for a visit, and he doesn't want to see borderland filth on his future driveway." Eleanor's grip tightened on her teacup until the porcelain groaned. She watched Alistair reach out with a slow, clumsy hand, beginning to scrub the stone with a rag. He looked broken. He looked pathetic. But then, he looked up. Just for a second. His eyes caught Eleanor's through the glass of the morning room. There was no pain in them. There was a terrifying, silent signal. Watch. At that exact moment, a messenger in the Valois livery burst into the courtyard, his horse foaming at the mouth. He didn't even wait for the guards to clear the way as he scrambled toward the manor's entrance, screaming for the Marquis's steward. "The mines!" the messenger gasped, his voice carrying through the open window. "The northern mines in Valois territory. The workers have walked out. They say a sovereign order was delivered at midnight. Every furnace has been extinguished, the iron price is skyrocketing, and the Marquis' contracts are failing by the hour." The guards standing over Alistair froze. The laughter died in their throats. Alistair didn't stop scrubbing. He didn't even look up as the guards scrambled away to deal with the chaos. He simply moved the rag in a slow, deliberate circle, a small, dark smirk hidden by the shadow of his hair. The Marquis had struck at Eleanor's grain, but the secret Duke had struck at the very heart of the Marquis's power, his iron. And as the bells of the capital began to toll, signaling a financial crisis the city hadn't seen in a decade, Eleanor realized that the servant husband wasn't just a shield, he was a siege engine. The air in the morning room was thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain, but inside the Beaumont Manor, the atmosphere was far more suffocating. The first strike had landed, and the impact was intended to be terminal. The Marquis de Valois did not believe in quick deaths. He believed in the slow, agonizing collapse of one's dignity. By noon, the official decree had reached the manor. All Beaumont grain vessels were to be impounded at the Northern Quay indefinitely. The excuse was a suspected infestation, but the reality was a noose. Eleanor stood at her window, watching the estate's servants already beginning to pack their bags. Loyalty is a luxury the poor cannot afford when their mistress is drowning. She felt a presence behind her, not the heavy, lumbering tread of the blacksmith, but the silent, predatory shadow of the Duke. "The trade routes are the veins of this house," Eleanor whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Valois hasn't just blocked them, he's severed them. My creditors will be at the gate by nightfall. They smell the blood in the water." Alistair stepped into the light, his tight servant's livery straining against his shoulders. He didn't look like a man whose world was ending. He looked like a man who had just seen a predictable opening in a game of chess. "Valois is arrogant," Alistair said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "He thinks power is found in decrees and seals. He forgets that trade doesn't stop because a politician says so. It just moves into the dark." He reached out, his massive, calloused hand covering Eleanor's on the windowsill. I need you to call a dinner tonight. Invite the Marquis. Invite the council. Let them see you desperate. Let them believe the Beaumont flame is flickering out." "And what will you be doing while they toast to my ruin?" Eleanor asked, looking up into his obsidian eyes. "I'll be in the tunnels," Alistair replied with a dark, lethal smile, "calling in the ghosts of the north." That evening, the Beaumont dining hall was a den of jackals. The Marquis de Valois sat at the head of the table, his silk doublet shimmering in the candlelight. He watched Eleanor with a sickeningly triumphant pity as she picked at her food. "A tragedy, really," Valois drawled, swirling a glass of deep red wine. "To see a house of such history reduced to, well, to this. Perhaps if your husband spent less time at the forge and more time studying maritime law, your ships wouldn't be rotting at the docks." A ripple of laughter went around the table. The minor nobles leaned in, eager to participate in the humiliation. "Where is the brute anyway?" a young baron sneered. "I had hoped to see him spill wine on his own livery again. It was the only entertainment we had this afternoon." "He is in the kitchens," Eleanor said, her voice trembling, a perfect performance of a woman on the verge of a breakdown. "Scrubbing the floors, where he belongs." Valois chuckled, leaning back. "A wise choice. Some beasts can be trained, but they should never be allowed in the light." But outside the dining hall, beneath the very floorboards where the Marquis sat, the beast was moving with the precision of a master assassin. Alistair had shed the servant's tunic, moving through the Beaumont secret passages in nothing but his dark trousers and a heavy belt of tools. He reached the old wine cellar, where 3 men in tattered cloaks were waiting in the shadows. They didn't look like servants. They looked like soldiers who had crawled out of a grave. When they saw Alistair, they didn't laugh. They fell to one knee, their heads bowed in absolute, terrifying reverence. "The Blackwood Pass is clear, my lord," one of the men whispered, his voice raspy from years of exile. "The Marquis's iron shipments are currently being diverted." "He thinks he's blocked the grain, but he's about to find out his own treasury is empty." "Good," Alistair growled, his eyes igniting with the cold fire of the Iron Duke. "By the time the dessert is served upstairs, I want the Marquis to receive a message. Tell him the secret sovereign has returned his interest. With blood." Back in the dining hall, the Marquis was just lifting his glass for a final toast to the end of the Beaumonts when a messenger burst through the doors. The man was covered in sweat, his face the color of parchment. He stumbled to Valois' side, whispering frantically into his ear. The Marquis's smug expression didn't just fade, it curdled. The glass of wine slipped from his fingers, shattering against the white linen tablecloth like a bloodstain. "What is it, Marquis?" Eleanor asked, her voice suddenly losing its tremble and becoming as sharp as a guillotine. "Bad news from the mines?" Valois looked at her, then at the shadows near the door where a massive, soot-stained figure had just appeared, leaning casually against the frame with his arms crossed. It was the blacksmith. He was covered in grime, his eyes fixed on Valois with a look of such predatory hunger that the Marquis felt his heart skip a beat. "My iron," Valois stammered, his voice cracking. "The shipments. They've been seized. By whom? Who has the authority?" Alistair stepped into the candlelight. He didn't bow. He didn't move like a servant. He walked to the table, picked up a discarded knife, and drove it deep into the wood right in front of the Marquis. "The iron belongs to the north," Alistair said, his voice a tectonic rumble that silenced the room. "And in the north, Marquis, I am the only authority that matters. The first strike had been the Marquis's, but the second strike, the one that hit the bone, belonged to the Duke." The dining hall was still ringing with the echo of the knife Alistair had driven into the table, but the true war was no longer happening in the light of the chandeliers. As the Marquis scrambled to salvage his crumbling iron monopoly, the blacksmith slipped back into the skin of a servant, retreating to the damp, dark corners of the Beaumont estate. Midnight in the capital is a time for ghosts, and Alistair St. Clair was the most dangerous ghost of them all. He didn't use the grand front gates. Instead, he moved through a forgotten drainage tunnel that emptied into the black waters of the city's canal. He had shed the restrictive, mocking livery of the Beaumont house, replaced now by a suit of matte black tactical leather and a heavy cloak that swallowed the moonlight. He moved with a silence that defied his massive size, a shadow drifting through the labyrinthine back alleys of the cathedral district. He reached a nondescript cellar door marked with a faint, charcoal-rubbed symbol, a sun eclipsed by an iron hammer. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old oil and sharpened steel. 5 men stood in the gloom. They were the Knights of the Crimson Seal, the elite vanguard of the Valerius Duchy who had survived the purge by blending into the city's underworld as mercenaries, butchers, and thieves. The moment Alistair stepped into the candlelight, the 5 men struck their chests in a synchronized, muffled salute. They didn't see a blacksmith. They saw their sovereign. "My lord," the leader, a scarred veteran named Kalen, whispered. "The message was received. The Marquis's iron shipments have been diverted to the northern caches as ordered. His financiers are panicking. By morning, he will be forced to liquidate his hold on the Beaumont grain ships just to pay his debts." "It isn't enough," Alistair growled, his voice a low, predatory rumble. "Valois is a snake. If you cut off his tail, he will only grow a more venomous head. I want his communication lines severed. I want every bribe he sent to the High Council intercepted. We aren't just breaking his pockets, Kalen. We are erasing his influence." "The Council is already suspicious, sire," Kalen warned, stepping closer. "They've noticed the servant at the Beaumont Manor moves with the gait of a commander. The Marquis has hired the Black Mask assassins to shadow the estate. If they see you tonight—" "Let them look," Alistair said, his eyes igniting with a cold, terrifying fire. "A wolf doesn't lose sleep over the opinions of sheep. Keep the pressure on the iron markets. Ensure the Beaumont grain ships are released by the 3rd bell tomorrow. If the harbor master refuses, burn his office to the ground." Alistair reached into his cloak and pulled out a small blood-red wax seal, the crimson seal of the Iron Duke. He pressed it into the palm of the veteran's hand. "The war in the ballroom is a game of whispers," Alistair said, turning back toward the door. "But the war in the streets is a game of blood. Tell our brothers the exile is over. The Shadow Duke is calling in his tithe." As he slipped back into the night, the knights disappeared into the shadows of the cellar, a silent army mobilized by a man the world thought was cleaning stables. But back at the Beaumont Manor, a different kind of storm was brewing. Eleanor sat in her chambers, the fire in the hearth burning low. She had heard the secret door in the library click shut an hour ago. She had felt the absence of the man who had become her only anchor in a sea of vipers. She stood up, her hand resting on her stomach, and walked toward the small washroom, where Alistair usually changed out of his soot-stained clothes. On the floor, partially hidden beneath a discarded tunic, she saw something glinting in the moonlight. She leaned down, her fingers brushing against a heavy blackened silver chain. Hanging from it was a ring so massive and ornate, it felt like it carried the weight of history itself. She didn't recognize the crest, a crown resting on a bed of thorns, but as she touched the cold metal, a shiver of pure ancestral fear raced down her spine. "What are you, Alistair?" she whispered to the empty room. She didn't have time to find the answer. From the hallway, the sound of heavy, arrogant boots approached her door. The Marquis de Valois hadn't waited for morning. He was coming for his pound of flesh, and this time he wasn't bringing ledgers. He was bringing a scandal that would change everything. The heavy oak doors of the Beaumont bedchamber didn't just open, they were thrown wide with the force of an imperial warrant. The Marquis de Valois marched in, flanked by 2 high priests of the imperial judiciary and a gaggle of whispering court gossips. Eleanor barely had time to hide the silver chain in the folds of her gown before the Marquis was upon her, his face a mask of twisted righteous triumph. "The time for games is over, Duchess," Valois spat, his voice echoing in the vaulted room. "We have tolerated your marriage to a borderland brute as a quirk of grief, but the Empire cannot tolerate fraud. The judiciary has received word that the Beaumont heir, the child you carry, is a fabrication designed to protect your titles from forfeiture." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground. "A fabrication? You stand in my private chambers and accuse me of faking the very life I carry? You've lost your mind, Marquis. Or perhaps your failing iron minds have made you desperate." Valois' eyes flared at the mention of the mines, but he stepped closer, his finger pointing at her midsection. "If it is real, then it is a bastard. No borderland chaplain has the authority to bless a union of the first rank. By the law of the High Court, a duchess who bears a child by a commoner without a sovereign dispensation is stripped of her name, her lands, and her freedom. The child will be born in a debtor's prison, Eleanor, and your blacksmith will be hanging from the palace walls before the sun sets." One of the high priests stepped forward, holding a scroll sealed with the emperor's own wax. "Lady Beaumont, you are hereby ordered to appear before the full court of sovereigns at dawn. You will undergo a formal examination of blood and lineage. If the father is indeed a man of no rank, the Beaumont estate will be dissolved and handed to the Marquis de Valois as the closest male kin in the northern line." The stakes hadn't just doubled, they had become absolute. This wasn't just a threat to her property, it was a threat to her child's life. In the Empire of Oakhaven, a nameless child of a fallen duchess often disappeared to prevent future claims to power. "And where is he?" Valois sneered, looking around the room for the massive shadow of the blacksmith. "The brave Alice? Has he fled back to the mud now that the law has arrived? Or is he hiding in the kitchens, trembling over his porridge?" Eleanor felt a cold sweat on her neck. Alistair was still out in the city, meeting with his knights. If he was caught returning to the estate by the Marquis's guards, he would be executed on sight as an intruder. "He is working," Eleanor said, her voice finally betraying a tremor. "Indeed," Valois laughed, turning to the door. "Working on his final prayers, I hope. Guards, post a watch at every entrance. If the blacksmith attempts to enter these grounds, kill him. We have no further need for the brute. The Duchess has already provided us with all the evidence we need to end her story." As the room cleared and the heavy doors were locked from the outside, Eleanor sank onto the edge of her bed. She was a prisoner in her own home. She looked down at her hand, still clutching the heavy blackened silver ring she had found. She didn't know what the crest meant, but she knew one thing. Alistair St. Clair was not a man who prayed. He was a man who acted. And as she heard the distant, rhythmic tolling of the city's bells, the signal for the dawn session of the High Court, she realized that the only thing standing between her child and a prison cell was a man the world thought was a servant, but who carried the weight of an empire in his pocket. The vulnerability was no longer a secret. It was a weapon, and the Marquis had just pulled the trigger. Now it was up to the Shadow Duke to see if he could outrun the bullet. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the echo of the Marquis's threats lingered like a foul scent. Eleanor sat alone, the heavy silence of the manor broken only by the rhythmic pacing of the guards stationed outside her door. She opened her palm, the cold metal of the chain biting into her skin. The ring she had snatched from the floor was massive, forged of a dark, star-lit silver that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. She brought it closer to the flickering flame on her nightstand, her eyes tracing the intricate, brutal beauty of the engraving. It wasn't a standard noble crest. There were no lions, no eagles, no flowery scripts of the Oakhaven elite. Instead, it depicted a crown of jagged iron thorns resting atop a heavy squared anvil. Surrounding the image were ancient runes, the script of the Old North, a language that had been forbidden since the Great Purge 5 years ago. "The Iron Crown," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. She had grown up hearing stories of the North, of the fierce and sovereign Duchy of Valerius that refused to bow to the Southern emperors. They were a people of mountain and forge, ruled by a line of warrior dukes who were said to be born with the strength of the earth itself. But those stories had ended in fire. The last Duke of Valerius, Alistair St. Clair, was whispered to have been executed in his own courtyard, his entire bloodline erased to make way for the Marquis de Valois' expansion. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She looked from the ring to the door where her servant husband had disappeared into the night. If this was the ring of the St. Clair sovereigns, then the man she had hired in the mud wasn't just a soldier or a skilled smith. He was a king in exile. He was the rightful owner of half the empire's northern wealth that the Marquis had stolen and built his current power upon. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Alistair hadn't come to the capital to help her. He had come to reclaim a throne. Every time he had bowed to the Marquis, every time he had let the guards mock him, he hadn't been enduring it out of necessity. He had been measuring the depth of their graves. "You didn't marry a blacksmith, Eleanor," she murmured to herself, her voice trembling. "You invited a god of vengeance into your home." Suddenly, the weight of the ring felt immense. If the Marquis or the high priests found this in her possession, it wouldn't just be a scandal of pregnancy. It would be high treason. They would execute her alongside Alistair, and her child would never see the light of day. She scrambled to find a hiding place, her fingers tracing the hollows of her bed frame, when she heard a soft, metallic click from the library's secret partition. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the corner. Alistair stood there, his black tactical gear stained with the night's dampness, his eyes sharp and lethal. He saw her standing by the candle, the silver chain dangling from her trembling fingers. The silence between them was taut, a wire stretched to the breaking point. Alistair didn't move to take the ring. He simply watched her, his face a mask of iron-hard calm. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," he said, his baritone voice grounding the room's chaotic energy. "The Marquis was here," Eleanor breathed, her eyes wide. "He's forcing the examination at dawn. He knows about the baby, Alistair. He's going to strip the Beaumont name. But this—" She held up the ring, her hand shaking. "This changes everything. If they see this, they won't just imprison us. They'll burn the city to get to you." Alistair stepped into the circle of candlelight, his presence swallowing the room. He reached out and gently closed her fingers over the ring, his warmth seeping into her cold skin. "Let them burn it," Alistair whispered, his gaze locking onto hers with a terrifying, sovereign intensity. "The Beaumont name is a shield that has served its purpose, Eleanor. But tomorrow at dawn, we stop hiding behind shields. Tomorrow, I will show them the sword." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, intimate second. "Keep it safe. It is the only crown I have left to give you. By noon tomorrow, the Marquis will realize that the man he called a servant is the only man who can grant him mercy, and I am not a merciful man." The dawn did not bring light to the capital. It brought a cold, suffocating fog that clung to the spires of the Solstice Palace. Today was the day of the Grand Auction of Souls, a barbaric legal tradition where the debts of a fallen house were settled by selling off their lands, their titles, and their very future to the highest bidder. The great hall was packed with the elite, a sea of silk and predatory eyes. At the center of the room stood the high podium of the imperial auctioneer. To the left, seated in a chair of shamed oak, was Lady Eleanor Beaumont. She looked fragile, her face pale, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. Beside her, standing with his head bowed and shoulders slumped in the ill-fitting livery of a servant, was Alistair. The Marquis de Valois stood at the front of the gallery, a glass of vintage nectar in his hand. He looked like a man who had already won. "Members of the council, citizens of Oakhaven," Valois proclaimed, his voice dripping with feigned sorrow. "It is a tragedy to see the Beaumont line end in such squalor, but the law is absolute. Their granaries are empty, their ships are seized, and their accounts are frozen. They are bankrupt, not just in coin, but in character." He turned a mocking gaze toward Eleanor. "Since the Duchess cannot pay the imperial tithe, and since her husband, the blacksmith, brings nothing to this union but the scent of coal, the Beaumont Northern Territories are hereby declared open for acquisition." The auctioneer stepped forward, his gavel raised. "The opening bid for the Beaumont North, including the Iron Pass and the ancestral seat, is 5 million gold sovereigns. Do I hear a bid?" The room went silent. Every noble looked at the Marquis. This was a choreographed execution. No one would dare outbid the man who had orchestrated the fall. 5 million, Valois said, his voice a smug purr. "And let it be noted that I do this as an act of mercy, to ensure the peasants of the North do not starve under the mismanagement of a fallen woman." 5 million. "Going once," the auctioneer called. "Going twice. 10 million. The voice didn't come from the gallery. It didn't come from the council. It came from the center of the floor. The room gasped. Heads whipped around. The auctioneer froze, his gavel suspended in midair. Alistair had straightened his spine. The slumped servant was gone. In his place stood a man who seemed to grow in stature until he dominated the entire hall. He stepped forward, placing a hand on the auctioneer's podium with a force that made the wood groan. "You dare speak?" Valois roared, his face turning a purplish hue. "Guards, remove this animal! A servant has no voice in this chamber." "I am no servant, Valois," Alistair said. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a tectonic rumble that silenced the room. "And you are no creditor." Alistair reached into the breast of his rough tunic. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound scroll sealed with a wax that made the high priests turn white as ghosts, the imperial black seal. 10 million gold sovereigns, Alistair repeated, tossing a heavy iron-bound satchel onto the floor. It burst open, spilling not just gold, but ancient minted coins of the House of Valerius, currency that hadn't been seen since the Purge. "Paid in full by the Treasury of the North, a treasury you thought you had emptied 5 years ago. Marquis?" "This is madness!" Valois screamed, his glass shattering on the floor. "Who are you to claim the Valerius treasury? You are a blacksmith, a wretch from the mud!" Alistair looked at Eleanor. She stood up, her hand reaching into her gown to pull out the silver chain. She handed it to him in front of the entire empire. Alistair slid the ring onto his finger, the iron crown of thorns. He raised his hand, and the sunlight catching the dark silver seemed to burn. "My name is Alistair St. Clair," he declared, his voice echoing like a war drum. "Sovereign Duke of Valerius, Lord of the Iron Pass, and the rightful husband of Eleanor Beaumont. I was not exiled, Marquis. I was waiting, and while you were busy stealing grain, I was busy rebuilding the army you thought you had burned." The hall erupted into chaos. The revelation was a physical blow to the council. The Marquis fell back into his seat, his eyes wide with the realization that he hadn't bankrupted House Beaumont. He had walked into a trap 5 years in the making. Alistair didn't stop. He turned his gaze toward the council members, his eyes landing on each of them like a death sentence. "Now," Alistair said, a dark, lethal smile spreading across his face. Let's talk about the purge. Let's talk about the 24 secret ledgers I recovered from the Marquis's private vault last night. And let's talk about which of you council members took his gold to sign the death warrants of my kin. The grand auction was over. The purge had begun. One by one, the Shadow Duke began to read the names, and for the first time in history, the nobility of Oakhaven realized that the man they had mocked was not their servant. He was their executioner. The silence in the great hall is no longer the silence of respect. It is the silence of a tomb. Alistair stands at the center of the marble floor, no longer hunched, no longer hiding. The ill-fitting servant's livery seems to strain against his frame, not because it is small, but because the spirit of the Iron Duke has finally outgrown the lie. He looks up at the Marquis de Valois, and for the first time, he doesn't just look, he commands. "The auction is closed, Marquis." Alistair's voice is a low, tectonic rumble that vibrates through the soles of everyone's boots. "You cannot buy what was never truly lost." Valois is trembling, his face a grotesque shade of ash. "Guards! Why are you standing there? This peasant has stolen the Valerius signet. He has murdered a duke and taken his name. Seize him! Execute him where he stands!" The Imperial Guards move, their halberds leveled at Alistair's throat. But they stop 3 paces away. They don't stop because of a command. They stop because of the sound echoing from outside the palace. Sound. A deep, rhythmic thudding, the sound of thousands of armored boots hitting the cobblestones in perfect unison. It is the march of a professional army. "Your guards won't move, Valois," Alistair says, stepping toward the high podium. He reaches up and slowly, deliberately, rips the servant's crest from his chest, throwing it into the dirt. Because they know the difference between a politician who pays them and a sovereign who leads them. "My Knights of the Crimson Seal have held the city gates since the second bell. The ports are locked. The garrison has surrendered." The high priest of the judiciary leans forward, his voice shaking. "If you are indeed Alistair St. Clair, the sovereign of Valerius, then you were declared dead by the Emperor's decree 5 years ago. You have no legal standing to stop this auction." "I have the only standing that matters," Alistair counters. He turns to the side, extending his hand to Eleanor. As she stands and walks toward him, the crowd parts like the Red Sea. He takes her hand, and the iron crown of thorns on his finger catches the light, casting a jagged shadow across the hall. The decree of death was based on a lie fabricated by the men in this room. A lie used to steal the North and bleed its people dry. But iron, once forged, does not simply vanish. It waits. It tempers. Alistair turns back to the Marquis, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. "You thought you were buying a duchy today, Valois. You thought you were breaking a woman and erasing a child. But you've only succeeded in one thing. You've gathered every traitor in Oakhaven into a single room, and now I'm going to close the doors." Eleanor looks at Alistair, her eyes wide with the realization that the man she feared was a monster is, in fact, the only justice left in the world. She sees the way the nobility shrinks back, the way the vultures suddenly look like prey. "Alistair," she whispers, her hand tightening on his. "Stay behind me, Eleanor," he says, his voice softening only for her. "The revelation is over. Now, we move to the purge. It's time these men learned that a debt to St. Clair is always paid in full." He looks toward the gallery, his gaze landing on the first of the council members. "Lord Holloway, let's talk about the 10,000 Beaumont gold pieces you accepted to certify the accidental death of Eleanor's father. Shall I read the ledger, or shall we simply let the executioner find the truth?" The grand auction has transformed. It is no longer a sale of property. It is the beginning of a reckoning. The Shadow Duke has returned, and the marble of the Solstice Palace is about to be stained with the colors of the North. The air in the great hall, once filled with the perfumed scent of the elite, now smelled of stagnant fear. Alistair stood before the council like a monolith of impending judgment. He didn't need a sword. The heavy leather-bound ledger he held in his scarred hand was far more lethal. Alistair opened the book. The sound of the parchment turning was like the cocking of a crossbow. "Lord Holloway," Alistair began, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "5 years ago, you oversaw the sanitation of the northern grain stores. You claimed they were infested. In reality, you sold that grain to the Eastern raiders and used the profit to buy your seat on this very council. Here is the manifest, signed by your own hand, stamped with the stolen Beaumont seal." Holloway, a man known for his booming voice, could only produce a strangled wheeze. He looked to his left for support, but the other council members were staring straight ahead, desperate to look invisible. "And you, Baron Vance," Alistair continued, his gaze shifting to a younger, trembling nobleman. "You were the one who verified the death of my father. You swore his carriage fell into the ravine by accident. Yet, here is the receipt for the 3 barrels of black powder you purchased from the Royal Armory just 2 days prior. A bit heavy for a hunting trip, wouldn't you say?" The Baron collapsed back into his gilded chair, his face the color of curdled milk. One by one, Alistair dismantled the pillars of the Empire. He didn't just reveal their greed, he revealed their incompetence. He spoke of forged death warrants, poisoned trade agreements, and the systematic dismantling of the North's defenses, all orchestrated to fill the pockets of the men sitting in the high chairs. "You all thought the Duke of Valerius was a myth," Alistair said, stepping closer to the podium where the Marquis de Valois sat cowering. "You thought that by killing the name you could keep the gold, but iron doesn't forget, and blood doesn't wash out of marble." The Marquis finally found his voice, though it was high and frantic. "This is a circus! You are a traitor, Alistair! You are a ghost who has come to haunt the living with forged papers! Guards, kill him! Kill the Duchess! End this madness now!" The Marquis's personal guard, the Black Mask assassins, detached themselves from the shadows of the pillars. Their blades were out, their movements fluid and deadly. They lunged toward the center of the floor, their eyes fixed on Alistair's throat. But Alistair didn't even reach for a weapon. Sound. The sound of a dozen crossbows firing simultaneously from the high galleries. The assassins didn't even reach the marble seal. They fell in a heap of black silk and steel, pinned to the floor by bolts bearing the crimson fletching of the Valerius Guard. Alistair looked up at the gallery, where his Knights of the Crimson Seal now stood, their crossbows reloaded and aimed squarely at the council. "The only traitors in this room are the ones wearing silk," Alistair said, looking back at the Marquis. "The purge is not a trial, Valois. It is a cleaning. The Beaumont lands are restored. The northern iron is reclaimed. And as for you..." Alistair walked up the steps of the dais, his boots heavy and rhythmic. He reached the Marquis's chair and leaned down, his face inches from the man who had tried to steal his life. "You wanted to auction off a soul today," Alistair whispered, a dark, lethal smile touching his lips. "I hope you've said your prayers, because I'm about to start the bidding on yours." He turned to the high priest, who was shaking so violently his mitre had fallen sideways. "Write the decree. House Valois is dissolved. House Beaumont is elevated to sovereign status, and any man who speaks against this child," he placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, drawing her to his side, "will answer to the Iron Duke personally." The hall was silent. The purge was complete. The vipers had been defanged, and the Shadow Duke had finally stepped into the light, not as a servant, but as the master of the Empire's destiny. The tension that had suffocated the Great Hall for hours finally broke, replaced by a heavy, reverent awe. The council members were led away in chains, their seats of power now empty husks. As the doors were thrown open, letting in the first true rays of sunlight the capital had seen in days, the secret war officially transitioned into the sovereign's peace. Alistair did not sit on the emperor's throne. Instead, he stood on the marble floor at Eleanor's side, his hand never leaving hers. The transition was seamless, a union not just of two people, but of two ancient powers that had been nearly extinguished by greed. The imperial herald stepped forward, his voice trembling as he read the new decree. By the blood of the Iron Duke and the grace of the Northern Duchess, let it be known, House Beaumont and House St. Clair are henceforth one. The Iron Pass and the Northern Plains shall be governed as the sovereign territory of Valerius Beaumont. The debt is settled. The line is restored. Alistair turned to Eleanor. The cold, predatory mask he had worn throughout the purge softened, revealing the man who had hammered iron in the rain just to keep her name alive. "The palace is yours again, Eleanor," he said, his voice a warm, deep resonance that only she could hear. "But we won't stay here. This place is built on whispers and rot. The north is where our strength lies. That is where our child will learn what it means to lead." Eleanor looked at the silver ring on her finger, then up at the man the world once thought was her servant. "You kept your promise, Alistair. You didn't just save my name. You gave this empire back its soul." The new reign was not marked by a coronation, but by a departure. As the afternoon sun hit its peak, a massive carriage, bearing the combined crest of a crown of thorns and the Beaumont sun, rolled out of the city gates. Behind it marched the Knights of the Crimson Seal, their armor polished and their banners high. The people of the capital stood in silence, watching the blacksmith duke lead his duchess back to the mountains. The rain in Blackwood is no longer cold. It is the gentle, nourishing mist of spring. The old forge at the edge of the forest still stands, but it is no longer a place of exile. It has been transformed into a monument of restoration. The surrounding fields, once barren and taxed to the point of death, are now a vibrant sea of green. The granaries of House Beaumont are overflowing, and the sound of hammers hitting anvils echoes from every village in the valley, a symphony of industry and hope. Alistair stands on the balcony of the restored Beaumont Manor, looking out over the Iron Pass. He is dressed in the simple, elegant black of a northern lord, his massive frame at peace. Beside him stands Eleanor, her pregnancy now at its full term, her face glowing with a serenity that seemed impossible during the Court of Thorns. "The grain ships arrived this morning," Eleanor said, leaning against him. "The trade routes are open from the capital to the sea. The Marquis's name has been erased from the ledgers. We are whole again." Alistair reached down, his heavy, calloused hand resting gently on the life moving beneath her gown. "It's more than grain and gold, Eleanor. It's a legacy. Our child won't grow up in a world of vipers. They will grow up in a world of iron, strong, honest, and unbreakable." He looked back at the forge in the distance, where a single plume of smoke rose into the clear blue sky. "The blacksmith is gone," he whispered, pulling her closer as the sun began to set over the mountains. "But the Duke remains, and as long as a St. Clair breathes, the North will never bow again." The spring air over the northern territories no longer carries the scent of stagnant smoke or the bitter chill of neglect. Instead, it smells of damp pine, fresh-turned earth, and the sweet, heavy aroma of blossoming orchards. The once rotting wooden bridges have been replaced by massive arches of hewn stone and Beaumont iron. A long caravan of merchant wagons, their colorful banners snapping in the wind, moves effortlessly across the mountain spine. There are no bandits here, only the Knights of the Crimson Seal patrolling the heights, their silver breastplates gleaming like beacons of order. The ivy has been trimmed, the white stone scrubbed clean of the capital's grime. The fountains in the courtyard are flowing again, and for the first time in a generation, The ancestral sun crest on the gates has been replated in pure, shimmering gold. On the wide stone terrace overlooking the valley, Eleanor Beaumont stands watching the horizon. She is dressed in a gown of deep emerald velvet, her hair braided in the intricate warrior style of the North. Her hand rests on the cradle beside her, a masterpiece of dark wood and silver inlay, carved by the hand of a man who knows the soul of every grain of timber. Inside, the new heir to the United Houses sleeps, wrapped in the furs of the Valerius line. The heavy thud of boots echoes on the terrace. Alistair St. Clair approaches. He is no longer wearing the rough leathers of a smith or the tight, mocking livery of a servant. He wears a heavy mantle of black sable over dark, functional tunics, the attire of a sovereign who rules from the saddle, not a throne. He stops beside her, his presence massive and grounding. He doesn't look at the cradle first. He looks at Eleanor. The cold, lethal edge that once defined his gaze has been tempered into a calm, protective strength. The final shipment of iron reached the southern ports this morning, Alistair says, his voice a low, warm resonance. The Council's new leadership has signed the Permanent Trade Treaty. They've agreed to the Northern tax, and they've officially struck the Marquis's name from the Imperial archives. To the world, he never existed. Eleanor leans into him, her head resting against his shoulder. And the people, Alistair? The ones who lived through the famine? The granaries are full, Eleanor. I spent the morning in the village. They've stopped calling me the blacksmith or the Duke. They just call me Alice again. But this time, they say it with a smile. He looks out over the vast expanse of the Beaumont lands, where the smoke from 100 village chimneys rises peacefully into the clear blue sky. In the distance, the old forge where they first met has been preserved, its fire kept burning day and night as a sanctuary for any traveler seeking warmth. We built this out of ruins, Eleanor, Alistair whispers, reaching down to touch the small, sleeping hand of their child. They tried to break the iron, but they only succeeded in making it harder. This is our legacy. A land that doesn't bow, a family that doesn't break. Eleanor looks up at him, the silver signet ring on her finger catching the light of the setting sun. It was a long road from the mud to the mountain, my Duke. Alistair smiles, a rare, genuine expression that softens the scars on his face. He pulls her close, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the Beaumont sun meets the Valerius peaks. The road is finished, Eleanor. Now, we simply rule. A kingdom restored, a debt paid, and a sovereign peace that will last for 1,000 years. The journey of House Beaumont and the Shadow Duke has come to a close, but their legacy of resilience is just beginning. Thank you for staying through every spark of the forge and every shadow of the palace. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden power and ultimate justice, please consider subscribing to join our growing circle of storytellers. Your support allows us to keep crafting these cinematic worlds. Like the video if you felt the weight of Alistair's vow, and comment below with the moment that gripped you the most. Was it the revelation at the auction, or the first meeting in the rain? Until the next story begins, stay strong and stay sovereign. We'll see you in the next act.